welcome to the one and only debate format in the whole conference here, the last couple of days or so. But we figured that in the spirit of the political season, why have you guys sit through another panel or fireside chat or whatever? Instead we would kind of like explore a couple of different sides of an issue that we're all talking about, and that's really relevant for all of us who work in the space and have anything to do with AI these days, which is bias in AI models. And one of the things that John and I will be exploring is whether or not bias in AI models represents a risk to our society. And if so, what can be done about it? So with that, I'll take a step back and say that my name is Chris G. I am CEO of Chris G Consulting. My firm works with corporations to help implement AI and show teams what the proper use cases are for using it, and also highlight some of the governance issues, of which there are many, related to AI. So really a pleasure to be with you guys this morning.
Thank you, Chris. John Passmore. I am the CEO of Latimer AI. We've created an inclusive large language model, really specifically for the reason that you mentioned, to mitigate bias, especially as it relates to Black and brown people. So we've built our own database that has data and history about Black and brown culture. And we've deployed that. Several universities have adopted it. We have commercial uses for it. So look forward to talking more about bias, which is front and center for us.
Right. So just to level set a little bit, right? Because I think that a lot of times when I give workshops on this topic, at the beginning I would assume incorrectly that everyone had a good understanding of what bias was in AI models and where it comes from. Right? And one of my clients a few months ago, I remember talking on this very topic, and they said, well, how can a machine or a robot be biased, right? Just by definition, they're supposed to be unbiased. We humans are biased, but they're not. So I'll let, John, I think, you're an expert in the space and everything, so I'll throw that over to you. What exactly is bias in AI models, and where does it come from?
Well, every model has some bias, and it's generally supposed to be there, right? Every model has its own perspective, so to speak. So there's good bias, right? If you're checking for if there's AI that's checking for a tumor, you want it to be very focused visibly on certain things. But within text, like ChatGPT, what happened is a lot of the training data that was used was kind of just grabbed from the internet. So those could be comments from YouTube or Reddit, and I think if we've all read some of those comments, we realize that maybe isn't something that we'd want a machine to emulate.
Yeah. I think another thing that I see, because one of the most common and I think fast-growing developments in the corporate world as it relates to AI right now is the proliferation and construction of a lot of these on-premise AI models. And just so John, as you mentioned, most corporations, most companies are reticent, and rightfully so, to sort of put certain types of data into large language models like a ChatGPT, like a DALL-E, or Midjourney or something like that, right? Because you don't own that data, you don't know where that data is going to end up. And if it's sensitive information, it could be really problematic, and it could be problematic legally. So I'm seeing so many of the companies that I work with that are building these walled off proprietary AI models and AI systems. And one of the challenges that they're facing is that they either inadvertently or through the course of regular audits are detecting lots of bias. And so one of my clients recently was saying, well, Chris, where is this coming from, right? How are we getting this bias? Our data, they thought, is clean, right? But in fact, they're finding all of these anomalies. And so I think that in addition to what, John, what you're saying, one of the things that I'm seeing is that there are a lot of disparities when it comes to the data that ends up in some of these models, and all of these models, for instance. And so in one particular instance I can think of is there was a client I was talking to a few weeks ago, and they were saying that they were finding all these anomalies and all this bias. So we started looking under the hood, and one of the things that we found is that in all of their employee data, all right, I think that they had about, their company composition was about 65% female, But then when I started digging around and asking questions, and it said, well, what's the composition of your leadership and your C-suite? Well, that was about 60% male, right? And so because there was such a disparity in the data, right, there was a dearth of information and a much smaller data set, including female executives and C-suite members. The model started to sort of indicate that women weren't as strong candidates for leadership positions as men. Why? Because that's most of what it had in the data set, right?
Yeah.
That's most of what it had to draw on. And if you think about it from that perspective, it's in a lot of ways similar to human bias, right? If we don't know enough about something, haven't seen certain things, haven't seen people in certain positions or whatever. Hey, a tech person, a programmer, an engineer is supposed to look like what, right? Guy who's never been on a date before, blah, 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 the glasses, right? That's our bias, right? Well, then that's because of the limited amount of data and the limited amount of experiences that we've seen and the times that we've had confirmation bias around some of those same images. So it's somewhat similar when it comes to sort of like not having enough information in those data sets, and then those AI models that are supposed to be objective, right? We're saying, hey, we're going to believe everything coming out of it because it's not going to be biased, and then it's full of bias. So I think that that's also a big challenge in the corporate world that's happening right now. And I think that another challenge that I'm seeing is that, you know, most companies, and I think most of the companies you guys work for, I'm sure everybody performs regular audits to make sure that there's not data leakage, you know, that there's not sensitive information that's making its way into the on-premise tools. But very few of the companies I work with perform regular, very rigorous bias audits, right?
That's an area that's still kind of under development in Biden's executive order. One of the things that was last November that he asked for were some way to check for bias, and I don't think that there's a uniform way to do that just yet. So obviously this is an election year. I don't think much of the executive order has been operationalized. But to take a step back too with bias, I think, you know, one of the questions that we ask, if you ask ChatGPT, let's say, who are our most important artists? So ChatGPT has to then figure out, well, what does the person mean by our? But it's going to give you Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and Pablo Picasso, and you start to notice, hey, these are all kind of European artists. So there's no Chinese or Indian or African or even black artists if you ask that question. So that's goes to show that there's this kind of inherent bias. Most models, whether it's Claude or Gemini, will answer that question in a similar way. So there's a Western culture bias as well that's just baked in. And, you know, many times that's not an issue. But let's say that model is used by a local police department or a hospital, and now the hospital has to triage its emergency room. How does the model look at the people and say, okay, this person, is it just their injury, or is it going to look at other factors and say, oh no, this person is more important and they should get treated first? We don't know because, you know, the AI is kind of just being deployed in many cases.
Now, of course, we build this as a debate, so of course I'm going to take the devil's advocate, and anyone who knows me, and certainly, you know, my wife would probably rolling her eyes, but that's something that I do on a regular basis. So you know, just kind of like peeling back the layer on that, I would say that, like, you know, the premise of this chat is, does bias in AI represent a risk to our society? So my question would be, you know, the school I went to was probably the same way, right?
Yeah.
And where's the societal risk come in? I mean, I think that, like, the idea in a parallel about a police department is certainly valid, but in terms of, like, just the example that you gave, yeah, annoying, but, like, what's the big deal?
Well, you know, I think we've seen some disparities in terms of policing or over-policing. So what I think the danger is there is that we don't need another layer, maybe that's allegedly objective, that's telling a police or the management within the police force where they should be deployed and why. And without understanding, is it just looking at pure data, or is it looking at something that's kind of baked into the model? And we already know that we have some disparities in the healthcare system There is a documentary called Aftershock that was about maternal mortality, and I think black women in the United States, in terms of their mortality when they're giving birth, is almost equivalent to the third world. And in the documentary, it goes into a piece of software that I think it's a hospital in Oklahoma is using to determine who gets a cesarean section. And they just punched the data in, and without understanding why, it's recommending that more black and brown women have this surgery instead of giving natural childbirth. And because it's major surgery, there's increased mortality. So there's so many areas, I think, where AI could have a major impact that's detrimental, and that's not even getting into job displacement and who loses their job if AI can do their job.
Yeah, that's and another topic that I wish we had time to talk about, because it's certainly causing a ton of anxiety with probably much of the workforce that I talk to. I think another good thing for us to explore is just how prevalent is bias in it. Just a quick question, show of hands. How many of you in the audience right here regularly work with some sort of AI model, whether it's on-premise or a public model?
Wow.
All right, so we got pretty much everybody, right? So, also show of hands, how many of you have, in the course of that work, encountered bias in some of the data that you've gotten back? So most people, but not everybody who's like raised their hands and said they're working with AI tools. So how prevalent would you say bias is in AI systems and models?
I would say it's very prevalent. It may not always be apparent based on how you're interacting with the model or what you're asking it to do. So maybe it doesn't show up. And I think that, to me, is the fundamental risk, in that a lot of this bias is kind of baked in, and now we're just building on top. So now we get ChatGPT 5.0, but it's not like they ripped out everything that was wrong. They've just built on top. They've built what some people consider guardrails, which are software, kind of keywords. Maybe if somebody mentions this word, we're not going to respond in this way. It's actual human interaction that's built into the model. But I think it's a big danger that we're just building on top of models that are already kind of sketchy in some ways.
You mean, do you think it's dangerous that we built an AI model, a large language model, based on scraping information off the internet?
Yeah.
What could go wrong there, right? No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that if you said, hey, I want to build a tool and put as much bias in there as I possibly can, I might say, you know what, let's scrape the internet, right? Let's scrape social media, take all the stuff that's publicly available there, and I think problem solved, right? So yeah, I think that is a challenge. Now, I guess one of the questions I would have, and I'm sure probably many in the audience would have this, is like, okay, got it, this is the problem. What do we do about it, right? Do I sit down in front of ChatGPT or my on-premise model and just sort of tell it not to be biased about certain things? You can kind of program on the front end or whatever. Do I have to go and spend a lot of money to get developers to come in and do reweighting and things like that to fix these models? Or do I have to go and really kind of take another look at my data set and say, hey, you know what, maybe I need to do some cleaning and reprogramming there? I know I have some thoughts on it, but what are your thoughts?
I think we're seeing some companies that are more focused on that. So even Anthropic with Claude, and they're being more open. Even Meta doesn't have a tremendous track record when you look at, hey, what happened with social media? Should there be some regulation? And then it kind of never really happened, and it went way left. But they made Llama, which is an open source model, and so you can download the model. You can train on top, but you're not taking anything out of the model is kind of the issue. But I think there's enough people talking about it, and there's enough people concerned about it, that we're kind of headed in the right direction. I think the tension is that it seems like every 3 months the models kind of evolve to the next stage. So staying current with this pace of advancement is really where the issue is.
Yeah, You know, I now see, you know, again, so that we build this as a debate, so I'm gonna disagree with you here. I don't think that there is enough conversation about it. Certainly not in a corporate world. I think maybe, you know, in certain other spaces, I think there is, in a public sector, I think there is a lot of conversation, education circles. I think in the corporate world, and you know, certainly, you know, we'll have time for Q&A, so love it if somebody wants to take me on this point. But I really think that companies in corporate America are so focused on getting it out there, right? Getting it developed, getting it deployed, training people to get on it, realizing these efficiencies. And I think that if you bring up some of these issues, hey, what about bias mitigation, things like that, it almost is kind of like, you know, I get to be that person with the sad trombone, wah wah, right? Oh, now you're gonna have us go and do all this work, and we're gonna miss our milestones and all those things, and it's gonna be costly because we got this consulting firm doing the implementation. And they're hearing all these things when I'm saying, hey, what have you done about bias mitigation? Or even better, one of my clients, I remember a couple of months ago, said, oh, you know, we think we're good on that front. We don't think our system that we've trained has any bias in it. And I said, really, you don't think your system has any bias in it? And they're like, no, we don't think so. And I just, you know, what's that, right? Simple test, right? Very simple test. Write a job description for someone from Harvard. And then I asked it, now write a job description for someone from Howard. And the two job descriptions were different. They weren't totally different. That's the thing about bias and AI models, right? They were mostly similar, but there were very, very subtle, and in some cases overt, differences in each one, right? The assumption from the AI model was that the Harvard job description would involve a lot of strategic work and things like that. And there was some mentions in the Howard job description about being an inclusive environment and some things like that, which weren't present in Harvard. There was nothing egregious. There was no hate language or anything like that, but obviously just subtle differences in the expectations in each of those job descriptions. And I found that in just 2 seconds. I just sat back and boom, boom, boom. You know, hey, here's a couple of disparities I found in your so-called bias-free model, right? So I think that there's such an obsession to move fast, and I think there are some blind spots. And I think that there are a lot of companies that don't want to ask certain questions that are going to require them to slow down. Now, I talked about privacy, copyright, things like that. Big difference there is that we could get sued, right?
Exactly.
So I think that will cause pause. If the lawyers are on board, then you're going to say, okay, we're going to stop and we're going to make sure we're going to mitigate this stuff. But all too often, I think when it comes to something like bias, which is a little bit more squishy, I think that companies are less likely to want to incur significant cost overruns when it comes to something like that.
Well, I think I'd have to agree with you in this instance. I mean, we're in a period where DEI and any of the associated words, so inclusivity, to some degree bias. Like, what bias are we talking about? We're talking about racial bias. It's not an issue with our company. So yeah, we see that. So we're in agreement there, and we have had. Let's say a very large insurance company that's focused on, hey, can we use your tool to read emails? We have agents across the country, and we get, you know, a significant amount of lawsuits or disgruntled people that feel like, hey, this agent is interacting with me in a way that's inappropriate, whether that's bias or some other manner. And yeah, the tool can kind of pick that up and flag it either for the agent or in some cases maybe flag it for their boss, which is, you know, the whole other level of privacy. But if you're working for a company, I would assume that your emails are the property of the company. But I think we're just going to see different levels of sensitivity from different industries. You know, insurance, banking, healthcare, these are regulated industries, so a lot more oversight. Any, you know, tech companies are, you know, move fast and break things still.
Yeah, no, that's for certain. Well, so, you know, another topic that I think would be probably interesting for all of us sitting here, there is obviously one of the areas where AI is really starting to become implemented more frequently is into hiring software. for recruitment purposes. In fact, if anybody in this audience is looking for a job or was looking for a job in the last 6 months, it's highly likely that there have been a number of tools in the ecosystem for hiring that include AI and probably were involved in filtering out your resume or filtering in your resume, right? And obviously we know that that system and that process has been, filled with bias all along from the very inception. Humans are inherently biased, and whether good or whether bad, the bias works its way into the hiring process. So, from a perspective of force of good or force of evil or not good, I would say, what are your thoughts on some of the potential risks of integrating AI into hiring practices to be able to filter out candidates?
I think you mentioned it earlier. In many cases, it'll just reinforce what's there. They'll say, well, this is the makeup of our workforce. We want to maintain that, whether it's age or gender or race. So the machine, so to speak, could be working just to maintain what's already there. So it's reinforcing an existing bias. I think, I think it's a tool. Some people will be sensitive to that, sensitive to how it's deployed. Other people, less so. Other companies, less so. We, for better or worse, we have a country that is looking at kind of the same set of facts in very different ways. So you have a large group of companies that don't feel that this is an issue or don't feel that it's something that needs to be addressed by them. We have, as I mentioned, we had Biden's executive order. So the question is, does the government have a role in addressing some of the issues that you're talking about in terms of fairness? Probably does, especially in terms of, as we mentioned, regulated industries, banking, healthcare, hiring, are all already regulated. So how do you extend that to some of these new tools?
Yeah, and just for, if in the case there's anyone in the crowd who doesn't wake up every day reading the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, watching MSNBC or CNN, whatever, can you just explain a little bit about what was in Biden's executive order?
It was more directional that, and then there's a more recent law on the books coming down from California, which affects really big companies. I think it was $100 million invested in the training of the model is where California is setting the bar, so to speak, on what they want to regulate. But Biden was focused on several things. If you're doing business with the government, and that's many companies, that there would be some red teaming, there would be some way to test your model to make sure that it's not discriminating. Again, we as a private company, we want to be involved in that process. We've published a white paper on bias. We want to create a tool. We're working with Morgan State University on that, on the actual implementation of the technology. But it's, again, there's, as we've discussed, bias can be subtle, number one. To a degree, you do want to have some bias. If a tool is focused on women, then there should be something that's pointing the model in that direction. So there's a built-in gender bias. So it's a positive bias as was built in. And so the software that's built to test these things has to take that into account. It has to take into account, even if you're having a conversation, let's say, with ChatGPT, it needs to understand the context of your query. So if it's the fifth thing that you asked about something and it answers that query, but it's kind of based on the four things that you asked previously. So how does software understand the context of a query to really understand, is there bias in it, in the response?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for explaining that, because I'm sure that there was at least one person who was maybe wondering, like, what was in there? I think that, again, since we're kind of doing a point counterpoint, up until maybe recently, I thought bias. I thought that AI as a part of the applicant hiring process, screening process, whatever, is a terrible thing and is going to exacerbate existing bias in hiring systems. And but then, what really kind of gave me a ray of hope, and I am an optimist at heart, is the Unilever case study. And so anyone who's not familiar with the Unilever case study, Unilever started understanding that humans are inherently biased, and even if we're not talking about racial or gender or things like that, we're biased toward even certain types. I spent most of my career in the agency world, and there is a type of agency person, think your Don Draper type or whatever, front of the room, own the room, get up there, blah, 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 blah. That the agency world for executives is biased toward. If you're a little bit shy, if you're a little bit more quiet or whatever, the bias works against you, and it doesn't matter what you look like or what your characteristics or ethnology, whatever. So what was interesting about what Unilever did is that they were able to create a program, using AI and integrate it into the hiring process that helps to circumvent and mitigate the human bias, right? How does it do that? One of the things that it does is it analyzes the video from the interviews and looks at sort of the characteristics and traits that are not subjective, right? Body language, quality of responses, things like that. There's also gamification involved, with the process and everything that helps to level set some of the scoring and everything. I thought it was a really interesting and innovative use to be able to use AI, understanding that there's bias, right, to then mitigate some of that bias. And as a result, apparently, based on what's been published about the case study, they've been able to bring a more diverse set of candidates forward to be able to be hired as part of the process, whereas previously those candidates were being screened out. So I thought that was an interesting sort of ray of light to be able to say, hey, maybe it's not all doom and gloom, right? Maybe we can actually use AI, understanding that there's bias, circumvent some of that bias in the system itself and also in the humans who are part of the panels in the hiring process.
Yeah, I think I'm an optimist as well, and I think that affects what you view as the possibilities with AI. I think, if you look at any particular day on Twitter or X, you see kind of a very robust argument between people that are called doomers, that believe this is the worst thing that we could possibly do, and people that are optimists. And well-known optimist is Jan LeCun, who heads up AI at Meta. I think what we're seeing is an evolving set of practices, even on the human side. So, you're talking about hiring. I was sitting next to an English teacher who said, well, while we do use AI in scoring essays, so it kind of goes through, we take the names out. Because there's this weird kind of, if the machine reads the name, God knows where this bias came from, it will change the score of the essay. And I think the same thing in hiring, that's been proven, that the person's name on the application somehow affects the results. So we're developing better practices, in some cases weaving our way around some of these biases with just business practices that can mitigate them.
That's interesting. But how would, I guess my question would be then, how would, if let's say my name was, Jamal, right? So let's say, when my resume first gets submitted, there's no name on there. So it gets all the way up to the hiring manager. At some point, the hiring manager is going to have to know, hey, you're meeting with Jamal Tuesday at 3, right? So, is it just like, hey, look, the model can only get, the system can only get that far, and then once we get to that far, human bias is going to take us where it's going to take us?
Again, I think it's an evolving set of practices. I think, if a company, again, is sensitive to it, that they could say, well, 90% of the black people or brown people that this particular HR person met with were never hired versus the average at 60%. There's something in the human aspect here that it's in the data that we're seeing in the data that's not where it should be.
Yeah.
So data's a slippery slope as well, as it can be used to reinforce an idea or detract from an idea. So again, at some point, I think it comes down to, are you optimistic about this technology? It certainly has some pretty significant risks. Again, we're not really talking about some of the other issues around, what does it do with jobs? What do the people without jobs do after, if they are in fact displaced by AI, which is huge. We haven't talked that much about education, but it's, the schools, we work with a lot of universities, are kind of all over the map. I have a teenager. I know that he could write an essay in under 60 seconds with ChatGPT. That's something that schools are grappling with as well.
Yeah. No, I think that there's so many issues, and I think that I mean, for instance, like with the schools. I did speak at one university relatively recently where they didn't allow the students to use AI in a generation of any of their work. And I thought that was short-sighted for a couple different reasons.
Yeah.
One, every single one of those kids is going to graduate and going to have to use AI,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
In their career, right? It's not like some of us, I'm a little bit older than I look, guys. So, it's not like me where it's like I got fewer years left in my career than behind me. These kids have their whole career ahead of them, and it's going to mostly involve AI, and most of the rest of my career is going to mostly involve AI, right? So I thought it short-sighted. When are you supposed to learn this stuff, be introduced to some of these concepts if you're not getting introduced to them in college, right? So I thought that was short-sighted. I get some of the downsides, but to me, and I think anyone who's used AI, if you're going to write a good paper, you're going to have to know something about the subject, right? I mean, you could tell ChatGPT, all right, well, do a paper about 12th century England or something like that, and it'll do it. It won't be great, but it'll do it, right? You won't get a great grade on it, but if you know how to use the model, if you know how to prompt it, if you know something about the subject matter, oh, by the way, it's going to hallucinate too. So, some of those kings or whatever may not really be real kings in history, right? Some of those events might be false. So, but I think that students who understand how to use the model, understand how to prompt it, know the subject, but don't necessarily have to sit down and write every word of a 5,000-word essay, right? They will get the most out of those systems, and they will be the most prepared to enter the workforce, because that's how they're going to have to use the model when they get into the workforce, right? If they need to create a job description, they're not going to sit down and write the whole thing. They're going to say, here are the broad strokes, here are the bullet points and everything. You flesh it out. I'm not going to sit here and spend my time doing that. I'm going to spend my time doing more high-value tasks. So I thought it was kind of short-sighted. I mean, I get some of the issues, but I think that also the education system is a little bit archaic. I think that's you're like a little bit. You're like a little archaic, right? Yeah, just a bit, right? And I think you're a little stuck on like what it used to be and how we did things when we were younger, as opposed to sort of like what the generation that's coming ahead, how they're going to have to navigate through information and put together content, et cetera.
Well, in defense of education, we did just have, COVID. And all educational institutions, colleges, elementary schools had to make room for that. And most deployed relatively quickly remote learning, which, for some organizations was a massive change in how they do things. So we do see that, and that was probably a good precursor to getting ready for AI, in that they had to respond to something that was fairly massive, and they had to respond quickly. I think the issue is that, let's say, a person is bad with their grammar, and they can use a tool, and the tool basically kind of obscures that lack of understanding of grammar, and maybe that, maybe you can go very deep in your career with that if AI is going to be kind of along for the ride for your whole career. But it does obscure areas where you are deficient, and that is kind of an issue. Are we just building this crutch where young people then never really feel like they don't have to really learn certain things because they'll always have this assistant? And I don't know, until the power goes out, maybe they're right.
Yeah. No, you're right. I think that is definitely a risk, because, and why do I say that? Because I would say that ever since we started using all of this technology that we use now, I'll give you an example everyone here can relate with, right? Everyone here texts someone every single day and you do not know that number by heart, right? You don't. But I'm sure also everybody here can remember their phone number from their grandmother from when they were 10 years old, right? Or their best friend's number from high school, right? It's etched in your brain. So I think you're right. As we introduce this new, or I'll give you another one. GPS, right? You're at my, I have a car. I've got, it hooks up with my phone and everything. And I swear, I plug it in to go places that I've been to millions of different times, right? Just because I don't want to think about the path. I don't want to think about whether I should take this road at this time of day or that road. I want the GPS to tell me, nope, don't go down the FDR. It's going to be crowded, too much traffic. Go this way, right? And I just get to my destination. All I have to do is make the turns. I'm just a robot behind the wheel. So I think you're right. I think that as we introduce these technologies, inevitably, certain skills that we used to have, like memorizing phone numbers, memorizing directions, and looking at landmarks, our brains sort of, gets smoother in that area, and we kind of start using it for other things. So I think you're right. There is a risk that we'll get worse with things like grammar. If you're not great with grammar and you've got these models writing your papers for you, you're probably not going to get better at it, right? And you got Grammarly that's going there, it's going to check your grammar for you anyway. It's like you're not going to really think about like where to use Oxford commas and stuff like that. But I don't necessarily know that that's wrong, right? Now, my mother, who's a teacher, would probably be rolling over in the grave right now hearing me say that. But I think that just like we don't need to use that brain space for those old phone numbers, just like we don't need to use the brain space for for the directions and everything. I'm not saying that you don't have to have good grammar, but I'm saying that I think that there's a margin where we don't have to carry everything in our heads. And I think that that's probably inevitably where we're going as we use, my motto is AI as a co-pilot, not autopilot. So I think if we've got these really powerful tools to help assist us in our pockets and in our computers at the ready, we probably are going to let go of some of those things in our brain, and that's maybe inevitable and possibly okay.
It's possibly okay. I think this is kind of like a core issue with AI, in that is it going to make us dumber, essentially? And there's certain things that you had to memorize, right? You had to read it 10 times, whether it was your Spanish vocabulary. There's like no shortcut. You had to memorize something. If you never have to memorize anything, like what happens to your thinking capability? You're essentially becoming like a prompt generator machine as opposed to a human thinking machine, because you're only thinking about, well, what do I have to do? It's like, already I think a lot of us use Google, like, I'm not going to remember that because when I need to know it, I'm just going to Google it, and then, so I don't have to remember it. And I think that's kind of the issue, is like, what are we becoming? Are we becoming like an extension of a machine, of an AI, where we know that all I got to do is write the prompt, and if I get really good at prompts, then I don't even need to be totally conversant in the subject matter. You mentioned England, but with the right prompts, you don't even have to know all the details, as long as it doesn't hallucinate.
Yeah.
So, and it does still hallucinate. I got an excellent example of that last night. I was surprised, but it does still hallucinate.
Well, now you got to.
It was a simple thing. I have a business client, and my son was using my ChatGPT to talk about or to look at the background of one of his teenage football players, and it said, "Oh, this teenage football player is an executive at this healthcare company." And I'm like, where in the world did it take these two very disparate pieces of information, mash them together? And it said I have 5 sources. I was like, what are your sources for that? And it's, oh, sorry, excuse me, you're right, I'm wrong. There are no sources for this. I was like, okay, that's a little concerning.
Yeah, it's a lot concerning. Well, that's where when you talk about these term papers and everything, that's exactly an example of what might happen, right?
Yeah.
And it happens pretty regularly. All right, so we've got a little bit more than 5 minutes left. I don't know if there's any questions. Okay, you've got a question. So you're perfectly situated. If you could just grab one of those mics from the gentleman with the baseball cap back there. We can. Yeah, we're just going to take a couple questions. While he's doing that, show of hands, how many people here would say they're doomsayers about AI?
Wow, all right.
All right, how many of you would say you're optimists about AI? All right, so mostly optimistic in here. On the fence, we got one on the fence. All right, jump right there.
So on the issue of bias, from my perspective, there are really two ways this could be solved. And in the spirit of debate, I'd love it if you could pick a side and debate it. This could be solved at the LLM layer, or it could be solved at the training data layer. And I'm curious which of those two you find more persuasive based on what you're seeing in the issues.
You want to go first?
I mean, if I had my choice, I would obviously want it to be in the training data. I think once you have flawed training data and you're building guardrails around it so that it doesn't show up, there's always going to be kind of this unexpected question or unexpected use where that data shows up somehow.
Yeah. So just to comply with your request, I will say I think that just like you said, the ship has already sailed, right? Whatever analogy we want, the horse is out the barn, and we've got all these models, whether they're corporate, private corporate, or they're public models that are already filled with data, with bias. So I think that at this point, we've got to do the corrections at the LLM model. Whether that is in some cases programming, and in other cases it's going to be from the point of view of developers. I think if someone were to start an on-premise tool tomorrow, and say, hey, we're going to build our on-prem tool, we're going to start to populate information into it, then yeah, I would say, you really want to take a look at that data, and you really want to make sure that, there's as little bias in there as possible. But there's not going to be zero bias once you're finished, training the model. So I think the rest of that work's got to happen there.
Yeah, one other point is really the current architecture of LLMs, they're called kind of one-shot, meaning if you have a query on this end, there's an answer that's going to come out, whether it knows whether it has the data or not, it's going to pull something because it's built to spit out an answer. But it could be made to be recursive, to say, hey, the thing that you're about to tell that person, is it correct? It's just, if you could imagine ChatGPT, that would double, their number of queries from, is computationally expensive to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the conversation. Really insightful, timely, important. I find a lot of times that if we go to humans and say, you should not do this, it's bad, it's not very motivating. But if you could speak about the commercial opportunities from bias correction, it can sometimes be really, really useful. So the context is I run a product company. We serve business owners all over the world. I deliver a lot in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian languages particularly are pretty weak in a lot of these models. They don't have a lot of presence in the models. And so there's been a lot of work done in Southeast Asia to bring a lot more quality on a number of different LLMs. And so there's amazing commercial opportunity if I can speak to my audience in not only the right language, but also the right cultural context. So what kind of insight can you bring around the commercial opportunities from correcting this bias?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest is probably addressing underserved markets and opportunities, right? When I say underserved markets, that in some cases can mean communities, but also can mean markets, in a sense that every company, when you look at their customer base or their client base, they are leaving money on the table, right? There are opportunities that are not being realized because of bias, right? Hey, here's where the money is. These are the companies that have the most money. This is where we should be playing or whatever. Okay, well, that might have been true 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever, but there's this whole new market that sprung up that you're not addressing because of those types of biases. So I think that that's one of the biggest promises in terms of commercial opportunity that I've seen with a lot of businesses, is to be able to use AI to more effectively analyze markets, do market data, identify opportunities that are not being realized, and then also be able to help strategize how you can realize some of those opportunities, right? Who are these cohorts? What motivates them? What types of messaging, content, do they care about, et cetera, that's going to make them be more interested in our product, service, whatever it might be. That can be beneficial in terms of product development. It can be beneficial in terms of sales and enablement, and it can be beneficial in terms of customer service. And that's just sort of like skimming a top layer. But every business, and I, like I said before at the beginning of my intro, I've worked in the agency world for a number of years. I've worked with a ton of Fortune 500 companies, and they're all leaving money on the table, and they know it. So I think that's one of the promises of AI from a commercial viability perspective.
Yeah, we built a tool at Latimer just for that very reason. We see a lot of use cases. I see that our clock is counting down. So
Yeah, our clock is counting down. It may shut our mics off soon, but thank you guys.